talk a little bit about jointer safety. We'll talk about what the jointer is used for, we'll talk about the different parts of the jointer, and we'll talk about how to safely use the jointer. The jointer is mainly used for taking an edge of a board like this is the edge of a board, and making it perfectly straight, smooth, and flat. You want these edges to be straight, smooth, and flat for a couple of reasons. First off, if you go ahead and use a table saw, and if the edge you run up against the fence in the table saw is not very straight, it might wiggle as it's going through the blade a little bit, and it could kick back at you. Another reason is it just looks better. It looks better and feels a lot nicer, and it'll make your project a lot nicer when it gets done. And another big important reason why you want those edges to be nice and straight and flat and smooth is if you are going to join two pieces together. So here I have two pieces that have two unjointed edges. And if I put them together like this, you can see the gap in between them. It's pretty big, they're not together very well, and it doesn't look very good, and it would not glue up very good if you want to join these together. However, the other edges of these boards are jointed, and if I put these together, you can see how nice and clean those two go together, and you can't really see any daylight in between them, and they would glue up really nicely and be a very, very strong joint. So that is the main reason why you use a jointer, to get the edges nice and smooth and prepared for using other machines, for your project, and to join boards together. Some of the different parts that you might want to know for the jointer are the following. This piece right here is called the in-feed table. This piece is called the out-feed table. So on other machines that we've talked about in the past, if it had a big flat surfaces, it's always called the table. Same thing here, only this actually has two tables. They're actually two separate tables. They're not joined together as it might look. The in-feed table here, the out-feed table there, just as I said. This big stand-up piece right here is called the fence, kind of like on the miter saw that we talked about. The miter saw had a fence. This also has a fence. And this piece is called the blade guard. The blade guard swings open to expose the cutter head and then swings back into place with a spring. The on-off switch is a bright green and red switch. It says start and stop, and it's easy to find. You can't see it right now because it's below the view of the camera a little bit, but it is just down here. Before you use the jointer, you should think about, can I even use a jointer on the board that I have? The shortest board you can joint is 12 inches long. So if your board is shorter than 12 inches like this one, it's not safe to run through the jointer. If you're not sure if your board is exactly 12 or longer than 12, go ahead and grab a ruler and measure it out. But if it's shorter than 12 inches, you should not run it through the jointer. It's not safe. If your board is shorter than 12 inches, like this one for example, it does not give you enough to hang on to it as you push it through. So that's one of the reasons why you don't want to put a board through it that's shorter than 12 inches. Another issue is it's going to be really hard to do a good job with this machine. When you are using this machine, you need a certain amount of material on one of the tables at all times. And if you don't have a decent amount of material on one of the tables, then your cut is probably going to be wavy and rough, and then that defeats the whole purpose of the jointer. So on this board, for example, even if I put it right here, there's not a lot on this table, and there wouldn't be a lot on this table either, which means the board would not be well supported, and it could cause a bad cut. But if I have a longer board like this, even if it's right here, I have a lot on this table, and I'm starting to get more and more on this table, and the board is completely supported the entire time, so I know my cut will be nice and smooth. You never want to joint a board that's shorter than 12 inches. Something you might consider doing before you start using the jointer is check to see if the fence is perpendicular to the table. In other words, you want to make sure the fence is exactly 90 degrees to the table. The best way to do this is take a tri-square, set it on one of the tables, and then put it up against the fence and look at the back of the tri-square and see if there's any gaps or cracks back there. If there are gaps and cracks, and if this blade of the tri-square does not fit flat up against the fence, then the fence will need some adjustment. Talk to me, I will adjust it for you. I'm not going to make you adjust it. I will do that for you. So if you check it and you see that and it doesn't look good, let me know. I'll fix it for you. Most of the time it's not going to be an issue. It's almost always in square, but after a lot of students have used the machine over and over and over again, the fence can wiggle just a little bit, and then that can screw things up. So if you check it and it's out of square, let me know. If you notice a lot of students have used it and none of them have checked it for square, then it would be a good idea for you to check it for square as well. Another important thing to think about when you're going to be using the jointer is how to hold your material and how to push it through the jointer. A very, very important thing on this is making sure the material is flat up against the fence and down on the table. Because even if you checked to make sure the fence here is at 90 degrees, and I went and double checked that it's at 90 degrees and set it up because maybe it wasn't. If you don't hold your material flat up against the fence, no matter what you do, the cut you get is not going to be 90 degrees. You always want to make sure it's flat up against the fence. What a lot of times happens is students will let it creep away from the fence just a little bit. Like right now, for example, you might not actually be able to tell it's not flat up against the fence just by looking at it from the camera view right now. But there is a gap between the board and the fence down here, and it's not flat up against the fence, and that's going to give me an angled cut when I want it to be exactly 90 degrees. So always make sure you keep the board up flat against the fence and down on the table as you are pushing it through. And the other thing I brushed on is always make sure you use both hands on this machine. Most machines require you to use both hands in here, and this one is no exception. You always want to make sure you have one hand in front of the board and one hand back here when you're pushing it through. One thing you're going to want to think about is how to hold your hands when you are putting them on the material to push it through. What a lot of students want to do is they want to put their hands up here just like this. This is not a good idea. Even if you're standing on that side of the machine, it's still not a very good idea. What can happen here is, as you can see, my fingers are down here. They are really close to the cutter head. If I slip as I'm going through the cutter head and my hand goes down a little bit, I could get a severe injury to my fingers. So you always want to make sure you keep your hands in a fist. So what I like to do is I like to put my hand in a fist like this and keep one right here and my thumb out. I use my thumb to keep the board down, and then I use the knuckles on my fist to keep the board up against the fence. This way I can't get my fingers out of that fist and they can't slip down like that and get into the cutter head. They're safe because if I'm pushing up against the fence like I should be and down on the table like I should be, my fingers are not going to be able to easily slip out of that. So that is really safe. Same thing for the back as well. I put my hands like this. That way I use my thumb to keep it down and I use my knuckle to push the board through. So it's always a good idea to keep your hands in a fist, not open like this. That's not a good idea. Your fingers are getting too close to the cutter head and they could get injured. So always make sure you keep your hands in a fist, just like this, as you are pushing your board through. This board, as you can see, is taller than the fence. However, if you're going to joint a shorter board like this, that's shorter than the fence, you need to use push sticks. So before I was talking about how you need to hold your hands as you're pushing your board through. That only applies if you are going to directly use your hands to push your board through. But on a board that's shorter than the fence like this one, you need to use push sticks. If you don't have push sticks or can't find push sticks, let me know. I'll be happy to find you some or even make you some. But you always need to use push sticks when you are pushing a board through that is shorter than the fence. To use push sticks, you put them in about the same places you would put your hands, but again, it's just push sticks instead of your hands. So here I have two push sticks so I can demonstrate how that would look. So I'd put one right in the back right here, and then I'd put one right here. Also, you'll notice I stepped out from behind the jointer to show you this. Typically, you'll be in front of the jointer. I'm just standing behind the jointer mainly right now so you can see it as I talk about it, but most of the time, or all the time I should say, you'll be in front of the jointer when you're using it. But you would put one push stick right here, the other push stick right here, and you'd push your board through just like that. One thing we talked about when we were talking about the disc sander is how you should never use a disc sander to take a little bit of material off the end to make your board shorter. A lot of students seem to think, well, I can't use a disc sander, maybe I'll use a jointer for that. The jointer is even worse to use than the disc sander to make your board shorter. Again, the miter saw is by far the best machine in here to make your board a little bit shorter. This machine takes off about a 1/16 of an inch of your material at a time. So a lot of students think, well, I only have to take off a 1/16, I'll run it through here once, it'll take off the 1/16 I need, and it'll be good to go. What that would look like, however, though, would be if you take your board and stand it up like this and run it through just like this. This is called end jointing. So this is the end grain of your material, and this would be called end jointing. This is really bad for a lot of reasons. First off, in order to keep this board stable, you need to put your hands low, kind of by the cutter head, and that obviously is not a very safe thing. If you put your hands up here, they're away from the cutter head, and that's safer, but then the board's probably going to do this a little bit as you go through the jointer, and that's not going to be good, it's not going to be safe either. The other thing is, as you can see, the grain or the lines of this board is running this direction. So if I'm going to run this through the jointer on the end like this, what can happen is just as I'm getting ready to leave the cutter head, and what usually happens is because the grain is going this way, it's going to take that corner and rip it off and throw it down the room. Because the grain is not going the way you're pushing the board through, it wants to rip it instead of just cut it smoothly. So it's never a good idea to end joint your material. You only want to joint with the grain. So going this way would be with the grain. You never want to end joint. Only joint with the grain of your material. Some students come at me and say, well, my board is wider than 12 inches. I can end joint it then, right? Because like I said before, your board has to be longer than 12 inches. This still isn't the case because remember I talked about the way the grain is running. The grain is also very important. Not only is it not very safe because of the way you have to hold it, but it's also hard on your material because of the grain. So you always want to make sure, even if it's 12 inches wider, you do not end joint your material. I cannot stress that enough. That is probably the worst thing to do on this machine. You never want to end joint your material. Another big issue with end jointing is a lot of times it's when students just have to take a little bit off their board and then they'd be done. So then they run through the jointer like this, and like I said, it can break off the corner, so a big chunk gets ripped off, and now their entire board is ruined and they're upset about it. So again, end jointing, not a good idea. When you do use a jointer, please make sure the dust collection system is turned on. If you're not sure how to turn the dust collection system on, or maybe you don't know if the dust collection system is on at all, let me know. I can look into it. Or if you just want to go and push the button to start it up again just to make sure it's on, that's fine. That's not going to hurt anything. But you always want to make sure it's on when this is running. This will produce a lot of sawdust and it will plug up really quickly if you don't have the dust collection system on. And if you plug it up, you're going to be the one cleaning it out. And that can be a very, very annoying project where you have to reach way up into the jointer and clean everything out. So please make sure the dust collection system is turned on before you start using this machine. Another thing you might want to check for is the blade guard. You want to make sure the blade guard springs back into place like it should. So right now you can see it's doing its job and it's doing exactly what it should do. The idea is that after you push the board through like this, it'll spring back into place and cover up that cutter head, which is what you want to be covered up. You don't want that exposed. So always make sure that springs back into place. Sometimes I get asked, how many passes do I have to make on the jointer? Is one pass good enough? Do I have to make 2? Do I have to make 10? How many passes do you need to make on the jointer? The answer is it just depends on your board. Sometimes this edge is a lot rougher on one project compared to another. Sometimes it's curved a lot worse on one project compared to another. It just depends on your board. So if your board has a nice smooth edge that's pretty straight already, you might get by with only running it through once or twice. But if there's a big curve in it or if it's really rough, you might have to go 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times. It just depends on your project. This is not a situation where you can see a student in front of you run it through once and think that's all you have to do either. Or see a student in front of you run it through 10 times and think you have to run it through 10 times as well. It depends on every single project and every single board. It just depends on how your board is. This is really important to know because sometimes the boards I give you are just a little bit wider than what the final dimension needs to be. So if you go and run this through the jointer 10 times, your board is probably going to be too narrow and you're going to lose some point. So you always want to make sure you run it through just the right amount. You don't want to go too much, but you don't want to go too little and still have a curve or still have a rough spot in your project. When you are jointing, also make sure you don't put your hands directly over the cutter head. I know this might take a little bit of practice to get, but you never want to put your hands directly over the cutter head because if you do, you could slip, and if your hands are over the cutter head and they slip down, they can go into the cutter head. So when you are pushing a board through, just like this, keep your hands away from their cutter head. So right now, if I was pushing the board through, I would want to stop, pick my hand up, and put it over here, so that way I did not run my hand over the cutter head. Push a little bit more, stop, pick my hand up, come over here, and then keep going. But you do not want to run your hand directly over the cutter head while it is running. Lastly, you don't want to go too slow and you don't want to go too fast. About this speed is a pretty good speed to go through the jointer. If you go too fast, it's going to be a rough cut and it's not going to do a very good job. If you go too slow, it starts to waste a lot of time. So just make sure you go nice medium speed as you are running through the jointer. Overall, the jointer is a pretty simple machine, but is used for a very important process. If you watch this video and you have any questions, just let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. If you're not sure about what to do with a jointer or how to place your hands or anything like that before you use a jointer, let me know. I'll be happy to review any of this information with you. But otherwise, that's jointer safety.